Nadia Osman was 26 years old and, completely, spectacularly broke. Not the romantic kind of broke that happens in movies, where the girl has a tiny but charming apartment with exposed brick and a vintage lamp. No. The actual kind. The kind where you eat cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row and convince yourself it is a lifestyle choice. The kind where you check your bank balance and then immediately close the app because you already know, and seeing the number will only make you want to crawl under your bed and hibernate until something changes. Nothing was changing. She had a literature degree from a university she was still paying for and a job at Meridian Events Company that sounded impressive until you learned she spent most of her days printing name tags and assembling gift bags with tissue paper that always came out crooked. Her manager, a woman named Sandra who wore the same 3 blazers in rotation and talked about synergy without irony, had recently told Nadia she had potential. Nadia had smiled and said thank you and then gone home and eaten cereal. The only thing she had held on to from a childhood that had been mostly defined by loss, was her mother's necklace. A thin gold chain. A small pendant shaped like a crescent moon, the tips of it worn smooth because her mother had touched it so often. Rania Osman had worn it every single day of her life that Nadia could remember. In the kitchen making tea. At the school gates in the rain. At the hospital, during the last weeks, fingers still working the pendant even when she could barely lift her hand. When Rania died, 8 years ago, the necklace came to Nadia. She had worn it for 2 years, then taken it off because wearing it felt like carrying something too heavy around her throat. She kept it in a small dish on her bedside table instead. Looked at it every morning. Said nothing. Said everything. It was the last real thing she had of her mother. So when she woke up one Thursday morning and the dish was empty, something inside her went absolutely cold and still in the way that precedes screaming. She did not scream. She turned the apartment upside down. Checked the floor, checked under the bed, checked the bathroom drain, checked the pockets of every coat she owned. She was systematic. She was thorough. She was also, by the end of it, shaking. The necklace was gone. She retraced the previous day in her head. She had taken it to work, actually worn it, because she had been feeling the particular kind of hollow that sometimes required her mother's gold against her collarbone. She had worn it to the event setup. The Hartwell Gala. A charity thing at the old Callaway mansion on the edge of the city, the kind of event where people paid $500 a plate to feel good about themselves, and Nadia paid nothing but earned very little assembling centerpieces of white roses and wondering what decisions in her life had led her here. She must have lost it there. This was already a disaster. The Callaway mansion was not somewhere you could just drop by. It was a private estate, a closed event venue with a waiting list for bookings 2 years long, owned by a family that had been in this city since before the city was properly a city. She had been inside exactly once. Getting back in would require either a booking, a contact, or an embarrassing phone call to Sandra. She made the embarrassing phone call to Sandra. Sandra sighed in a way that communicated clearly that this was an inconvenience and also somehow a reflection of Nadia's general unreliability as a human being. But she made some calls, and by midday Nadia had a name, the estate manager, a man called Thomas, and a narrow window. Thursday evening, 6 o'clock, before the next event setup began. She could come look. She wore her sensible shoes. She tied her hair back. She told herself this would take 20 minutes and she would find the necklace near the table where she had been arranging centerpieces and everything would be fine. The mansion looked different at dusk. She had only seen it in daylight, full of hired staff and caterers and Sandra's aggressive organizational energy. Now, at 6 in the dim gold of the evening, it looked like something out of a story her mother used to read to her. Old stone that seemed to breathe. Ivy that covered the east wing entirely, fat and dark. Windows that were tall and narrow and gave nothing away. Thomas met her at the staff entrance. He was a compact man in his 50s with the particular brand of efficiency that comes from decades of managing things nobody else wants to manage. He gave her a laminated visitor badge and a torch and told her she had 30 minutes. He did not offer to accompany her. The ballroom was on the ground floor, past the main entrance hall and down a corridor lined with portraits she did not look at because she was here for a necklace and not for atmosphere. The room itself was enormous, the chandeliers still up from the previous event, unlit now, the white roses on the tables beginning to go over. It smelled like candle wax and something deeper, something stone and old that she could not name. She went to the table where she had been working. Checked the floor. Checked under the chairs. Checked the window ledge where she had set things down at some point. She was methodical. She was also aware, in the way that you are always aware when you are alone in a large old building at dusk, that the silence was the thick kind. Not empty. Occupied. She told herself to stop it. She was on her knees checking behind a table leg when she heard footsteps. Not Thomas. These were slow. Deliberate. Came from somewhere above her, the mezzanine level that overlooked the ballroom, accessible by a narrow staircase at the far end she had not noticed before. She stood. He was at the railing of the mezzanine, looking down at her. And, the first thing she thought, honestly, absurdly, her brain doing what her brain always did under pressure, which was to produce an observation so mundane it bordered on the insane, was that this man was designed to make people act foolish. Not handsome in the normal metric. Something else. Something older than handsome. He was tall in the way that tall people are when they are actually tall and, not just wearing lifts, the kind of height that rearranges a room around itself. Dark hair. A face that looked carved rather than grown, all angles and intention. Dark eyes that had caught the last of the evening light coming through the high windows and were doing something with it that light was not supposed to do. He was wearing a black jacket. A white shirt, open at the collar. And, at his throat, on a thin gold chain, was a crescent moon pendant. Nadia's brain did several things simultaneously. First, it identified the necklace with a certainty that was animal and instant, her mother's necklace, the one she had touched every morning for 8 years, the shape of those worn tips unmistakable even at this distance. Second, it attempted to construct some rational explanation for how her dead mother's necklace had come to be around this stranger's throat. Third, it failed completely at that construction. She said, across the dim ballroom, her voice coming out steadier than she had any right to expect, "Why are you wearing my mother's necklace?" The silence after that was the loudest thing in the room. He did not move for a moment. Just looked at her from the mezzanine with an expression she could not read, not surprise, exactly. Something more complicated than surprise. Something that looked, absurdly, like recognition. He came down the staircase slowly. She watched him the whole way. She did not run, which was either brave or stupid, and she would decide which later. He crossed the ballroom floor toward her, and, when he was close enough she could see his face properly, she noticed 3 things. The necklace was absolutely her mother's necklace, the expression on his face was not that of a man who had stolen something and been caught, and his eyes were the kind of dark that does not come from any ordinary genetics. He stopped a few feet away. She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something complicated inside her chest, but she was Rania Osman's daughter, and Rania Osman had once stared down a landlord twice her size without blinking, and Nadia had inherited the bones of that, if not always the certainty. "Where did you get it?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke his voice was low, unhurried, the voice of someone who had not been in a rush for a very long time. "I believe," he said, "that we should sit down." "I don't want to sit down. I want to know where you got my mother's necklace." He looked at her for another moment. Then, he reached up and unclasped the necklace from his throat, and he held it out to her. She took it. The gold was warmer than metal should be, she thought, and then decided not to think about that. "I have been waiting," he said, "for the person who would come looking for it." She stared at him. "How long?" He considered this. "Longer than you would find comfortable to hear right now." His name, he told her when they were sitting, because she sat despite herself, at one of the gala tables with the wilting roses between them, was Adrian Voss. He had owned the Callaway mansion for decades. Had owned it before the current city was anything more than a collection of buildings clustered around a river. He said this the way you say something that is true and inconvenient and you have long since stopped apologizing for. She said, "That's not possible." He said, "I know. She said, "Who are you?" And he looked at her with those impossible dark eyes and said something she did not expect. "I knew your mother." The roses between them sat and wilted, and the evening outside went fully dark, and Nadia sat very still with her dead mother's necklace in her fist and felt the floor of the world shift 6 inches to the left without warning. He told her carefully, in pieces, in the way that you give someone something they might not survive receiving all at once, that he had known Rania when Rania was young. Before Nadia. Before Nadia's father, even. That Rania had known what he was. That this had not frightened Rania because Rania had been the specific kind of person who assessed things on their own terms and not the terms the world handed her. He did not say what he was. Not yet. He did not need to. The dim room. The too warm necklace. The eyes that did something wrong with the light. The way he had said longer than you would find comfortable to hear right now about how long he had been waiting. Nadia was a literature student. She had read enough. She was not stupid. She was also, right now, operating on the specific kind of lockdown calm that comes when the emotional content of a moment is too large to process in real time, so the brain just keeps going through motions, asking questions, processing answers, while somewhere further back a much larger reckoning was queuing up. She asked, "Did my mother know you were what you are?" He said, "Yes." She asked, "Did she tell you where I was?" He paused. "She asked me to find you. If anything happened to her." Another pause. "It took me longer than I intended. I am sorry for that." Nadia pressed her hand flat against the table. The wood was solid under her palm. Real. She concentrated on that. "She never told me," Nadia said. Her voice came out flat in a way she hadn't meant. "No," he said. "She wouldn't have. She was protecting you." "From what?" He looked at her. The expression on his face was old in a way that had nothing to do with the appearance of his face, which looked perhaps 35 and was clearly nothing of the sort. It was the expression of someone who had watched too much for too long and had learned to carry it quietly. "From the fact," he said, "that you were not born into an ordinary life." Outside, the city went about its business. Inside the ballroom of the Calloway mansion, with the dead roses and the unlit chandeliers and the dark that pressed against the tall windows, Nadia Osman sat across from something ancient and impossible and turned her mother's necklace over and over in her hand. She did not leave. She should have left. She stayed because her mother had trusted this man, this creature, this impossible thing enough to ask him to find her daughter. And Rania Osman had been the most careful judge of people Nadia had ever known. Had trusted no one easily. Had given her faith in small precise doses, never wasted. If Rania had trusted Adrian Voss with the task of finding her daughter, then, whatever he was not something her daughter needed to run from. This is what Nadia told herself. She was not entirely certain she believed it yet. But she stayed. And he talked. Carefully. Slowly. As if he had rehearsed this conversation for years, which, she was beginning to understand, he might actually have done. He talked about Rania at 22, in this very city, in a different decade. Smart and sharp and completely unimpressed by things that were supposed to impress people. He talked about the necklace, which had not originally been Rania's but had come to her through a chain of hands that stretched back further than Nadia could currently absorb. He talked about what he was in the careful, matter-of-fact way that a surgeon discusses a procedure, precise, clinical, stripped of drama, because the drama is already inherent and adding more is just noise. He was vampire. Had been for longer than the city had existed. Was not what the stories made him, not monstrous, not a predator in the way that word implied helplessness on the other side. He was something older and stranger than the monster, something that had figured out how to exist alongside the world rather than feeding on it. Nadia listened to all of this. Processed it in the lockdown calm that was still operational. Asked 2 or 3 questions that were practical rather than hysterical, which seemed to do something to his expression, a small shift, almost like relief. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment. Then, she said, "My mother kept a box under her bed. Old. Wooden. With a brass latch. When she died, I couldn't open it. The latch was locked and I never found the key. He reached into his jacket pocket, produced a small brass key and set it on the table between them. Nadia looked at the key for a long time. She picked it up. The floor shifted again. The city outside kept going. The roses wilted. And, somewhere in the lockdown processing queue in the back of her mind, the larger reckoning stirred and stretched and began to wake up. She was not the same person who had walked through the staff entrance 30 minutes ago with a laminated visitor badge and sensible shoes looking for a lost necklace. She did not know yet what that meant. But she kept the key. The box was exactly where she remembered it. Under the bed. In the corner. Behind a shoe rack and a plastic storage container full of her mother's winter sweaters that Nadia had never been able to throw away, partly because grief and partly because they still faintly smelled like Rania's soap, something with almond in it, something clean. She had not opened this closet in 2 years. She sat on the floor of her mother's old room. She had kept the apartment, had been paying above her means to keep it, had told herself this was financially irresponsible, which it was, but some things are above the jurisdiction of financial responsibility, and she pulled the box out and set it in her lap. Old wood, dark with handling. The brass latch, small and tarnished. And, in her palm, the small brass key that a vampire had handed to her across a table of dead roses, as though this were a completely ordinary transfer of objects. She sat with the box for a while without opening it. It was nearly midnight. She had driven home from the mansion on autopilot, hands on the wheel, the city lights sliding past the windows, her brain running a background process that had not yet surfaced to her conscious mind. She had made tea. Poured it down the sink. Made it again. Sat with it until it was cold. Then, come here, to her mother's room, which was technically the second bedroom, but she slept in it sometimes when the grief was the shapeless kind, not sharp, just pervasive, like weather. She put the key in the lock. It turned. The latch opened with a small clean click that felt much louder than it was. Inside, papers. Folded, some of them old enough that the fold lines had gone soft. A photograph. A small envelope sealed with wax, the wax dark red with a mark pressed into it, a sigil she didn't recognize, circular, intricate. And, underneath everything, another necklace, not gold this time, but silver, with a different pendant, a small disc with writing on it so fine she had to hold it to the light to see, and, even then, could not read it. She picked up the photograph first. Her mother was young in it, early 20s, that narrow serious face Nadia knew from the photos before the photos of the photos, the ones from before she was born. Rania in a dark coat, standing outside a building that looked old and important. Beside her, a man. Adrian Voss. Looking exactly as he had looked this evening, in the ballroom. Exactly. Same face. Same height. The photograph was dated, in her mother's handwriting, in the bottom left corner, 1987. Nadia stared at the date for a long moment. She had known, intellectually, what he had told her. She had processed it in the calm locked-down way. But, there is a difference between being told a thing and having physical evidence of the thing in your hands, a photograph with a date on it in your mother's own handwriting, and the difference was that the lockdown processing queue finally, opened. She sat on the floor of her mother's room for a while doing nothing in particular. She cried, which was not what she expected. Not about Adrian, not about the impossibility of the photograph, but about Rania. About her mother keeping this enormous secret, this world-rearranging secret, and carrying it alone for all those years. About the careful, deliberate weight of the silence Rania had maintained. About the box under the bed and the locked latch and the key given to a man outside of time so that he could give it to her daughter if anything happened. The amount of love in that planning. The sheer meticulous love. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. Then, she picked up the sealed envelope. She opened it carefully. The wax broke cleanly. Inside, folded letter paper, her mother's handwriting, but different from the careful handwriting of the date on the photograph. This was the handwriting of the last year. The hospital year. Looser, the letters slightly larger than they used to be. She read. She read it 3 times. Then, she sat with it in her lap and stared at the window and the dark outside for a long time. Her mother had written about a world that ran alongside the ordinary one. Not hidden so much as overlapping, the same streets, the same coffee shops, the same bridges over the same river, but with another layer underneath that most people moved through without ever snagging on. Rania had snagged on it at 22, through Adrian, through a series of events she described in the letter as coming on me from the side, the way the interesting things always do. She had not been afraid. This came through clearly, even in the weakened handwriting. Rania Osman had not been afraid of the world beneath the world. She had been pragmatic about it, curious about it, careful with it. She had learned its rules. She had navigated its edges. She had kept it away from Nadia not because she thought Nadia couldn't handle it, the letter was specific about this, underlining it with the kind of emphasis that suggested Rania had thought about how this might read and wanted to be clear, but because you do not throw a child into water to teach them to swim. You wait until they are ready. The letter said, by the time you read this, you are ready. Adrian will have made sure of it. The letter said, there are people who will want things from you that I was never willing to give them. Adrian will explain what. He is the only person I trust completely in that world. Trust his judgment even when it costs you something. It will cost you something. The letter said, at the end, in handwriting that had gone slightly shaky, I am sorry I couldn't tell you myself. I wanted to see your face when you found out. I think you would have asked 12 questions immediately and, then, made tea. I hope you are drinking it. Nadia had made tea. Had poured it down the sink. Had made it again. She said out loud to no one, I poured it down the sink, Mama. She went back to the mansion the next morning. She had not called ahead. She did not have a number. She simply showed up at the staff entrance at 8 in the morning with the letter in her coat pocket and knocked on the door, and Thomas opened it and looked at her with the expression of someone who had been told to expect this. He brought her to a study on the second floor she had not been in before. Wood-paneled. Books on 3 walls. A desk large enough to function as a landing pad for small aircraft. The kind of room that communicated, through its sheer solidity, that it had been here long enough to stop caring what you thought of it. Adrian was there. He did not look like he had slept, which was either a meaningful observation or entirely irrelevant, she was not yet sure which biological rules applied. He looked at her when she came in. Looked at her the way he had the night before, that expression she still couldn't fully decode, the one that was more than recognition. She sat down without being asked. She said, she left a letter. He said, I know. She said, you know what it says? In its essentials. She wrote it in front of me. Nadia absorbed this. She was sick when she wrote it. Yes. You were there. A pause. For part of it. She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her chest, not quite grief, not quite gratitude, something that sat between them and had no clean name. Her mother, at the end, not alone in the way Nadia had always feared she had been. Rania, in the hospital year, with this impossible ancient man sitting nearby while she wrote letters to her daughter. She said, tell me what they want. He told her. It took 2 hours. She listened with her hands flat on her thighs and her back straight and her face doing the thing it did when she was processing, still, controlled, the kind of stillness that is made of active listening rather than passivity. He watched this happen and she caught him watching and did not say anything about it. There was a council. There was the word council and she wanted to laugh at it slightly because it sounded exactly like every fantasy novel she had ever read, except she was sitting in a real room with real wood and real books and real morning light coming through real windows, and the man saying it was real in a way that made the word real inadequate. An organized body of old creatures, vampire, but also others, because the world beneath the world was not populated by only one thing who had governed the overlap between their world and the ordinary one for a very long time. Adrian was among them, had been among them, but had not been part of the active council for decades because of a disagreement he described only as principled. Rania had known about the council because she had been approached by them. Not to join, to be used. A resource. She had something they wanted, which was tied to her family's lineage, which was longer and stranger than Nadia had known, which stretched back to a line of people who had always snagged on the world beneath the world and had always been useful to the things that lived there. Rania had refused them. Cleanly, without drama, the way she refused everything she did not want. They had been patient. Now Rania was gone, and the lineage had passed, and the patience of old things is a different kind of patience than human patience. It does not feel like waiting, it just feels like time, which they have too much of. They would come to Nadia. They would be polite about it. They would offer things. They were always polite. It was a manner cultivated over centuries because direct aggression was messy and patience was cheaper. He said, "You will not have to face them alone." "But, I needed you to understand what you were walking into before I said that." She said, "What do they want?" Specifically. He said, "Your blood carries a marker. A kind of resonance. It allows certain things to be done that cannot be done otherwise. They want access to it. They want you in proximity to certain events. They want what they wanted from your mother, which is everything, essentially." She said, "And my mother said no." He said, "Your mother said no." She said, "Good for her." A small pause. Something shifted in his expression, that almost relief again, or something adjacent to it. She said, "I need to know everything. What my blood does. What the marker is. What these events are. I'm not walking into something blind." He said, "That will take more than one conversation." She said, "Then, we should start." She came back the next day. And the day after. She came back 6 times in 2 weeks, which required her to call Sandra twice with excuses that Sandra clearly did not believe, and to rearrange the contents of her life in a way that felt less like disruption and more like a clarification, as if things were sorting themselves, belatedly, into the categories they had always belonged to. The study became a place she knew. The chair across from his desk, the angle of the morning light on the books, the sound of the house around her, old wood, old stone, its own particular language. Thomas brought tea without being asked. She noted this with a warmth she did not examine too closely. Adrian taught her. Carefully, methodically, in the same way he had told her about himself, no drama added to things that were already dramatic enough, no flourish where plain language served. He was a good teacher. This surprised her. He was also, she was beginning to notice, careful around her in a way that was not wariness exactly. More like consideration. As if she were something that required attention. As if she mattered in a way that went beyond the functional. She told herself this was because she was the daughter of someone he had known. That it was grief on his part, or responsibility. That she was reading too much into the way he sometimes paused in the middle of a sentence and looked at her as if checking she was still following, still there. She also told herself she was not spending more time than necessary thinking about the pause. She was spending, measurably, more time than necessary thinking about the pause. 2 weeks in, she asked him, "How long did you know my mother?" "Before everything else." "As a person." He was quiet for a moment. Long enough that losing her was its own kind of thing. What kind of thing? He looked at the window. Outside the morning was the bright sharp kind that came in autumn. The kind that does not resolve, he said. That simply becomes part of the background. She understood this with her entire body, the way you understand something that is already true of your own life when you hear it named correctly for the first time. She said, "She really trusted you." He said, "She made that very difficult not to honor." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. The fire in the grate made small sounds. Thomas had been in twice with things she hadn't asked for, and she was starting to suspect Thomas was not just an estate manager in the ordinary sense of the term. Then, Adrian said, quietly, "You are very like her." And Nadia, who had been told this her whole life and had never been entirely sure how to carry it, found that it landed differently now. Not as a replacement. Not as a shadow. As its own thing. As a continuation. She said, "The council. When are they going to come?" He said, "They already know you are here. They have been watching since the first night." She said, and they are being patient. He said, for now. She said, what happens when their patience ends? He said, that is what I am preparing you for. She looked at him. He looked at her. The fire made its small sounds. The morning light moved across the books. She said, then, prepare me. And, this all of it, the study and, the tea and, the 2 weeks of careful methodical teaching and, the small shifts in his expression she was not supposed to be cataloging, this was the beginning of something she did not have a word for yet. She would find one. Outside, the city went about its business, completely unaware that in an old mansion on its edge, a 26-year-old woman with her mother's necklace and a brass key and 8 years of grief she was only just beginning to properly hold was learning the rules of a world she had not known she was always meant for. And the council watched. And waited. And their patience, as all old things, was finite. They came on a Tuesday. Which was, Nadia thought, a very pedestrian day for this sort of thing. She had been half expecting a dramatic night, fog on the street, an ominous knock. She had not been expecting 2 people in good coats to arrive at the mansion at 3 in the afternoon with a politely worded request for a meeting and a bottle of very old wine as a gesture of goodwill. She was already at the mansion when they arrived. She was there most afternoons now. She stood in the entrance hall behind Thomas and watched them come in. A woman named Isolde, older looking than Adrian in the particular way that meant something different here, something that translated to more time rather than less, with silver hair cut close and eyes so pale they were nearly colorless. And a man named Dorian who was younger in appearance, dark-skinned, impeccably dressed in the way that communicated money without being obvious about it, and who looked at Nadia when he came in with an expression of assessment that he did not bother to conceal. Adrian was beside her. She felt this rather than looked the particular solid presence of him that she had, over these weeks, become calibrated to in the way you become calibrated to the specific temperature of a room you spend a lot of time in. Isolde said to her, you look like Rania. Nadia said, people keep telling me that. Isolde smiled. It was the kind of smile that had practiced itself over decades. She was formidable. It's a compliment. I know it is, Nadia said. They sat in the formal sitting room on the first floor. The one Nadia had been in only once before, high ceilings, furniture that was old and serious, a fireplace that Thomas had apparently lit in preparation. The bottle of wine sat on the side table and nobody touched it. Isolde talked first. She was very good at talking, the words came in a structure that was elegant and logical and moved toward its point with the kind of directness that was itself a technique. She talked about the council. About the work it did, the balance it maintained, the importance of what she called stewardship. She talked about Rania's lineage, Nadia's lineage, in terms that were respectful and precise. She talked about what they needed. It was, when stripped of the elegant language, exactly what Adrian had described. Access. Proximity. The use of something Nadia carried that she had not chosen to carry and could not put down. When Isolde finished, she looked at Nadia with those pale eyes and said, we are not asking you to become something you are not. We are asking you to participate in something you already are. Nadia said, and if I say no? Dorian, who had not spoken yet, said, then, we discuss alternatives. What alternatives? A pause. Polite. The kind of pause that is not empty. Adrian said, very calmly, beside her, there are no alternatives they will offer that are not forms of the same pressure. I want her to understand that clearly. Isolde's expression did something controlled. Adrian, she is here as an informed participant, Adrian said. Not as a resource being presented with options. If the options all lead to the same outcome, say so. The silence after that had edges. Nadia looked at Isolde. Looked at Dorian. Read the silence. Then, she looked at the window. Outside the afternoon was going gray, the particular gray of autumn that isn't quite threatening but has designs on becoming so, and she thought about her mother. Rania Osman, 22, who had been sat down by people like these and presented with elegant language and polite alternatives. Rania who had said no. cleanly, without drama, and had then spent the rest of her life navigating the consequences of that no with the particular exhausted grace of someone who knew what they had chosen and would choose it again. Nadia thought about the letter. The shaky handwriting. I am sorry I couldn't tell you myself. She thought about 8 years of a necklace in a dish by the bed and a locked box and a key held by a man outside of time. She thought about the weight of carrying something you didn't ask to carry, through decades, alone. She said, I'll tell you what I will and will not do. And this is not a negotiation. Isolde looked at her. Something in those pale eyes moved, not surprise. More like recalibration. I will participate in whatever you need my blood marker for on 2 conditions. 1. I understand every single thing it is being used for, in full, before I agree to any specific use. 2. I have an exit. A real one. Not a polite fiction of an exit. If I say I am done, I am done. Dorian said, those terms are my terms, Nadia said. Not a starting position. Another silence. Adrian was very still beside her. She could feel the stillness. Isolde looked at her for a long moment. Then, she said, slowly, Rania's daughter. Yes, Nadia said. And, she said no entirely. I'm being more generous than she was. I'd keep that in mind. It took 2 more hours to reach something that was not quite an agreement but was a framework, a structure that acknowledged Nadia's conditions while leaving enough flexibility that the council did not feel it had walked away with nothing. She watched Isolde work and filed away every technique for later use. She also watched Dorian, who was more careful than he initially appeared and who looked at Adrian with something she could not entirely read, not hostility, something older than hostility, some chapter of history she did not have access to yet. When they left with the wine still untouched, which she noted with private satisfaction, the sitting room felt larger. Thomas appeared with tea and she had stopped being surprised by Thomas's timing and had simply accepted it as one of the features of the house. She sat with the tea and the fire. Adrian sat across from her. She said, were my terms reasonable? He said, they were exactly right. She said, were you worried I would fold? A pause. No. She looked at him. You were a little worried. I was prepared to intervene if necessary. I didn't need you to. I know, he said. I was watching you not need me to. It was, he stopped. Looked at the fire. It was something. She held the tea in both hands. The warmth of it moved through her palms. She said, Dorian and you. What is that? He was quiet for a moment. Old disagreement. About my mother? He looked at her. Partially. She said, tell me. He did. Slowly, the way he told everything, in pieces, measured. Dorian had wanted access to Rania, decades ago. Adrian had refused to facilitate it. There had been a falling out. Not violent, old things rarely needed to be violent, they had too many other tools, but definitive. It had cost Adrian his seat on the council, which was the principal disagreement he had mentioned weeks ago, the one he had declined to elaborate on. He had given up his seat on a centuries-old governing council for her mother's right to say no. Nadia sat with this for a long time. She said, she knew? Yes. And, she never told me that either. She carried a great deal quietly, he said. It was the particular way she showed love. Making things smooth for the people she loved. Absorbing the rough parts herself. The fire made its sounds. The tea went warm in her hands. She said, I don't want to be smooth for. I want to know the rough parts. He looked at her. That expression, the one she had been cataloging and not admitting to cataloging, was fully visible now. Unguarded in the way it had not been before, or she had not allowed herself to see it before. I know, he said. That is not a problem I have with you. She looked at him for a moment. She said, how long did you know my mother before you stopped seeing her as a responsibility and started seeing her as a person? He said, that distinction happened very quickly. She said, and me? He was quiet. Then, he said, the distinction did not form in the first place. She looked at the fire. She said, that's a very careful way of saying something. He said, I am very careful with things that matter. The afternoon outside had gone fully gray now, the particular gray that had made good on its designs. Inside the fire was gold and the room was warm, and Nadia sat with the weight of everything, the necklace, the letter, the box, the lockdown processing queue that had been running for weeks and was only now, slowly, processing, and felt it all settled differently than it had before. Not lighter. It was not lighter. The weight of what her mother had carried was still there, and the weight of what Nadia was now carrying was real, and the council and their polite patience and their endless long game were all real and would require real things from her. But it was a weight that had a shape now, that she could hold properly, with both hands, in the light. She said, I need to quit my job. A pause. Probably, yes. Sandra will be terrible about it. You will manage Sandra. I manage everything, she said, and heard her mother in this, and did not mind. She looked at him. She said, I want to learn everything. Not just what they need me for. Everything. The whole world beneath the world. Every rule and every player and every history I am apparently already part of. He said, that will take a very long time. She said, I'm aware. She said, are you going to tell me you don't have time for that? He said, quietly, I have nothing but time. Then, she said, we should start. She stayed for dinner, which had never happened before. Thomas produced things from somewhere in the direction of the kitchen, and she and Adrian sat at the long table in the dining room with the gray afternoon dark outside the windows and the candlelight between them, real candles, which was either an aesthetic choice or simply the way things had been done here for so long that the habit had calcified, and talked. Not about the council. Not about markers or lineage or the world beneath the world. About her mother. He talked about Rania in ways Nadia had never heard, in the dimension of her at 22, the things she had found funny, the arguments she had made, the particular way she had of cutting through something complicated with one sentence that was almost always correct and occasionally devastating. He talked about her as a person who had lived, fully, before she was anyone's mother. And Nadia listened and received it and felt something complete itself in her, some picture that had always had a corner missing finding its last piece. She talked too. About growing up with Rania. About the specific quality of being loved by someone who showed love through preparation, through smoothing the rough parts, through letters written in shaky handwriting at the end. At some point the candles had burned down considerably and the wine on the table, the different bottle than the untouched council wine, which had disappeared somewhere, was lower than it had been, and Nadia was warm in the way you are when you have eaten well and talked well and have been in a room with someone you trust, and the gray outside had gone full dark. She said, she would have liked this. He said, which part? She thought. All of it. You and me talking about her. Me being here instead of running. The fact that I didn't fold with the council. She smiled, slightly. She would have been smug about the last one. He said, she had every right to be. She raised the person who did it. Nadia looked at the necklace in her hand. She had put it back on that evening, somewhere between the sitting room and the dining room. Hadn't planned to. The gold was warm against her collarbone. She said, she planned this. All of this. He said, she was very thorough. She said, she planned for me to end up here. He said, she hoped. She was careful to leave room for what you would want. A pause. She was also, yes, fairly confident you would end up here. Nadia thought about her mother, at the end, in the hospital room with the shaky handwriting and the planning. Arranging the pieces. Holding the key out to the person she trusted and saying, find her when I am gone. The weight of that love was tremendous and she held it with both hands in the light and it was okay. The weight was okay. She said, I'm going to want to know everything about you too. Not just the world. You. Your history. How long you've been what you are. All of it. He said, that will take even longer than the other. She said, I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her across the low candles. He said, "No. I don't think you are." Outside, the city, that ordinary city, the one that had no idea about the layer underneath it, the one where people ate cereal for dinner and printed name tags and argued about synergy, went on with its business in the dark. Inside, in a room full of candlelight, a woman who had come looking for a lost necklace and found instead the full shape of her inheritance, her blood, her mother's world, her own place in something larger than the life she had been living, sat with a glass of old wine and a warmth at her collarbone and the settled, particular feeling of someone who was found, after a long time, the room they were meant to be in. The necklace was around her throat. The key was in her pocket. The letter was folded against her heart. And, somewhere, Nadia believed, in the quiet, unverifiable way you believe the things you need to be true, her mother was satisfied. Rania Osman had made something beautiful out of a world that had asked too much of her. Had loved fiercely and planned carefully and held the rough parts alone so that her daughter would not have to. And now Nadia was here, in the room her mother had trusted, holding the weight her mother had prepared for her, not alone. Not smoothed over. Fully, properly here. This was enough. This was more than enough. This was everything.